Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. It is 12:01. Wanted to welcome everybody to today's Lunch and Learn. Appreciate you being here. Today, we're going to be covering tabletop testing, what you should be doing in your organization. Hope everybody by now knows me. I'm the CISO for Intiva, Dr. Jerry Craig. My background is on the screen. One thing I wanted to mention before we got into the agenda for this one is last time that we met, apparently questions weren't by default enabled where folks could submit. That has been fixed, so should anybody see any problems, please let me know either through chat or Q&A and we will address it, but it looks like everything's working as intended. And today we're going to cover a couple topics, the agenda being what is it really and why is this important? Building out a program, lessons learned, and evidence for auditors. And as always, we will have a couple minutes at the end for folks to post questions and get responses. So get ready and we'll jump right in. So what really is tabletop testing? Why is it important? I'm sure folks on this webinar have heard the term before. People have tossed it around in previous organizations. It's not a complex topic or problem or challenge to implement, but it means different things to different people. So in the simplest of terms, it's an exercise used to test the readiness of a simulated disaster or outage in your environment. And when we use terms like your environment, this could be anything from a data center, a company office, a remote site, maybe depending on what industry you're in, you could have equipment out in a manufacturing facility, but not actually have an office. You could have a warehouse. You could be working from home. So as we go through this, just understand that for each person listening, it's going to mean something different. But at the end of the day, we're looking at what is it that makes your business run? And if there was a disaster or outage, how would you be impacted? And the answer is going to be different depending on what you have and what were to be simulated in that disaster. So it's not going to be a simple answer like, well, if X happens, this is what's going to go on with my company. It's often linked as a component of a tabletop testing program, making it an official program that you're running within the organization. You have assigned folks to this, whether it's to facilitate the test, manage the program, provide reporting, etc. So it's more than just an exercise in a lot of cases, and it typically will come with a library of scenarios that exist so that you can test all facets of the organization's threat landscape. And again, these threats could be man-made threats, they could be natural disasters, they could be virtually anything. The nice part about having a library of scenarios is you're going to get some flexibility. You get to test with different things, test against different systems and different critical assets, and quite honestly, just change things up so that the same people are not going through the same exercise year after year, quarter after quarter. If you were to run the same scenario multiple times, you're going to get very good at running a scenario, but that doesn't mean that that's a projection of how you'll do in the real world when a real scenario comes by, unless you were lucky enough that the exact scenario that you tested was the one that occurred. In most cases, this is also an extension of your business continuity and or disaster recovery plan. Some folks have those as separate plans, some are a BCDR in one. The idea being, on the business continuity side, this is helping you determine, what's down, what's a critical asset, critical data, critical service, how do I map to it, how do I get it back up, what would I do? And then on the disaster recovery side, in a full-fledged disaster. So, if I'm sitting in Florida and I have a building and hurricanes are obviously a common annual occurrence, what if my building were to get hit with a hurricane, water were to flood the building and all of a sudden we couldn't work, our servers were down, data was inaccessible, etc. So that's normally where this fits in. Again, you create the program, work it into your BCDR, and then start mitigating and managing your risk. More recently, and by more recent, I mean in the last maybe 3 years, 5 years, we're seeing it as a requirement by cyber insurance providers. If not a requirement, it's at least a question on there. Do you have and conduct tabletop test exercises or something along those lines, maybe different verbiage, but they're meaning the same thing. We're seeing it in a lot of government contracts where if you're the sub to a larger prime, like a top defense contractor, for example, they're going to ask that. They may require it if you want to, participate as a sub to them. And you might see it by clients depending on which industry you're in and whether they want to do business with you. A lot of that's going to depend on the type of business that you do, the type of data that you store, the criticality of the systems that you may house or manage for them. So if they're just talking about maybe having a website that you're hosting for them, this may not be an issue. But if they're an e-commerce site, someone, let's say like an Amazon, where they're trying to ensure they're up from on Black Friday, just using that as an example, they may come and ask you additional questions because they want to make sure that you have a way to get them up and running quickly, because time really is money at that point. So again, a lot of different scenarios, a lot of different use cases and different outputs, but the premise for why we have this and why it's important is the same for everyone. To build out a program, this is in no particular order. I tried to give you a basic set of steps or orders that kind of logically that I would take, but you could feel free to add, remove, rearrange, etc. But as we walk through these, I think the first thing is you do want an overarching high level policy. I really would make that the first step, because that's going to tell you what does the organization want to do, what do they expect, what is our outcome. It's how you determine who the stakeholders are. If we're talking about it from a project management perspective, who are all the stakeholders? What is the scope? What are the success criteria? What gates are we going through for reviews? All of those types of things. If you don't have that and you don't get the executive leadership buy-in, it's just going to be that much more difficult to implement within your organization and to have folks take seriously. I also feel like if you try it any other way, you're putting, the cart before the horse, and you're really then pigeonholing yourself into what your policy will become. I think at a high level, you want an overarching policy, you want a goal to achieve, and then you want to develop your processes and procedures to meet that goal, not the other way around. You will want to create a repository for the library, and ideally you will have a library of more than one or two scenarios. And the one nice thing I want to point out about tabletop testing in general is this is one of the things where you don't have to go out and buy any expensive software or tools. Most people use Microsoft Office or some competitor of Microsoft Office, where you have some form of spreadsheet like an Excel, a repository, whether it's SharePoint or something else. But as long as you have things like Excel, Word, PowerPoint, and a place to put everything that everyone can access that needs access to it, you have all of what you need. What's really going to come out of this are the collateral duties of the individuals, the facilitators, what you expect of them, who do you want to bring to the table. And the biggest contribution you all will make in building this is your time. And not to say that time isn't important or isn't valuable or doesn't cost money, but no matter what solution we put in place for anything that we talk about in these webinars, time is always a component of it. So at least in this case, time is literally the only component that you need, and you may not have to spend any money out of pocket anywhere else. Having said that, as you guys build out your scenario library, you categorize different types of tests. You may find that you do have to spend money, but that's going to be more about what am I finding as the result of these? Where are my deficiencies and how do I need to correct them? So nothing to run the program, but you might need some budgetary input later. At the categorize and assign stages here, you're really looking for, can I break these into different test types so I can put them into different buckets and then assign difficulty levels? And when I say difficulty levels, you want to look at it more or less from what's a simple thing that I can walk through up to the most complex. If you're starting this in an organization, you're bringing people together for the first time, the last thing you want to do is throw a massive complex scenario at them. For example, I have 20 servers, they're in a data center, and the data center gets wiped out by a tornado. It's going to be very difficult for them to react to that. You might want to start with something like simple email is down. And even some of the simple ones like email is down, and you're thinking, well, why would I even waste my time with that? Well, if email and or video calls are the way that you communicate people, and the app that manages those or the vendor that manages those both goes down, how do you even communicate to your organization that you are down? How do you want them to continue working? How do they access different things? How do you give them updates? So you might have to get creative, but it's a very simple, easy one to start with that you'll see all of the complexities that come out of it, all of the confusion, and all the problems. And then as you start to manage these easier ones, you move up in difficulty. You may even want to consider testing with something that's not even that applicable to you. Just make it simple just to get people comfortable with the process. And you want to think about, from a category perspective, the obvious things like, okay, from a cyber perspective, what if my company was hit with a ransomware attack? and all of my assets were encrypted. But you also want to think outside of that and say things like, what if there was a natural disaster? What natural disasters would be applicable to you in your different locations? Don't assume or forget or overlook an entire category of types of tests that you could run, simply because you're looking at this from a cyber perspective, which is where most of this is derived from to get it off the ground. And at the assigned level, talking about a tabletop exercise versus a walkthrough, these are two terms that are commonly thrown around, have different definitions. But at the simplest terms, a tabletop exercise, you're going to sit in a room or virtually, and you're going to talk through a scenario, like you would be reading it off of a PowerPoint slide. On May 1st at 8 o'clock, this is what occurred. And then who would I notify? And each person in there is triaging it from the perspective of what they would do in the order that they would do. And you're capturing all this as a write-up, but you're not actually doing anything. When you go to a walkthrough, you're actually going to simulate something. So you may do a tabletop first on, this is my most critical asset, this server. What would I do if it went down? And then later you may run the same scenario again, let's say 3 months later, once you feel confident with the tabletop exercise, and you say, I'm actually going to go turn down that server, or I'm going to go destroy that server. And obviously you want to make a backup first, but you could simulate that server being destroyed and then have someone walk through what they said they would do and see if it works. So at bare minimum, for every scenario you create, you could create 2 scenarios, one as just the talking through of the tabletop exercise, and then a second one, the actual simulation or walkthrough. You're going to want to determine the testing frequency. I really believe you should be doing these more than once a year. I really think it's more like quarterly, and depending on the size of the organization, the type of work you do, the number of people and teams you have, you may want to have different departments doing different types of scenarios at a more frequent basis. So from a physical security perspective, you may do one of those annually, but then you want to do 3 or 4 cyber ones. And then maybe you want to do a couple for a web-based, like a website or an e-commerce. So mix and match, but determine your own frequency. Probably most important at this point is just decide how you're going to document everything, what tools you're going to use. That's really done kind of upfront, but as you go through it, you want everybody using the same thing. So if we're doing even a tabletop exercise, we're talking through this and we're documenting it, you don't want 6 different people documenting their steps in different applications. Ideally, you want them all to work out of the same document. And you have to consider, as part of your tabletop, what happens in the real world if a disaster occurs and the very tools that you would use to manage it are not available. And then when this is kind of wrapping up and you're looking at the results and you're looking at how good or poorly the teams perform, don't be surprised if at the beginning it's somewhat abysmal. The results will most likely be poor. People will not be used to doing this. They will not necessarily know their roles. They may say, hey, I know this is what I'm responsible for, but I don't know who I would reach out to. How long should I be waiting if I don't hear back? Who has the authority to tell me to do something? There's going to be a lot of potentially fear of do I want to take on the responsibility? What if I make a poor decision? What if I'm not fast enough? What if I overreact? Those kinds of things. So set real world expectations of both the exercises and the real event should it occur. And then also look at what are your expected results versus desirable. Another way to look at this would be kind of a good, better, best model. It's nice to say we desire this perfect ideal state, but the idea that you're ever going to achieve it may be difficult. It may not be realistic, but can I get 80, 90% of the way there? If you can get 80% of the way, then set that as your expected result. And as you get better and more efficient at these, you can bump up to 85, 90, and maybe one day you do hit ideal. And lastly, determine who the participants will be and assign roles and responsibilities. Let people disagree potentially with their roles and responsibilities, but assign something to them, because if they come to a meeting, they come to an exercise, and they have no idea what their role is, one, they're likely going to be very quiet and not chime in and support your exercise, but 2, they're not going to know what they need to do. It's going to be very uncomfortable. There's probably going to be a lot of anxiety during the exercise in that, well, what am I really responsible for? And this is a great way of finding out, do your people even know, whether from a management down perspective or the individual contributor up, does everyone know what everyone else's responsibility is? Depending on the size of organization, we throw a lot of titles around for people and a lot of collateral duties, but that doesn't mean that they understand what that means of them. And if all year they go through never having to deal with something, like a common example, I'll see someone be assigned a security manager in an organization and they do nothing security related all year. And then all of a sudden you have a ransomware attack and you go, well, you're our security manager. That person is no more equipped than, HR to handle it at that point. So make sure they understand it, give them the ability to push back and challenge those roles and responsibilities and say, hey, I own part of this, but someone else owns it, et cetera. And then hold the lessons learned. I think this is probably the most important piece of this entire process. To some extent, everything prior to this is compliance related, and this is really where the security benefits come in, because you want to determine where to publish a documentation so that the appropriate individuals have access to it. You want to learn what went well, what worked well, what didn't. And the goal is to improve, so next time you're better than the time before. You need to determine if results and risks need to be rolled up to executive leadership. Do you have a board that you have to report to? Do you have another group or committee in your organization? And if so, what format's needed for that presentation? There's no reason you can't work through all this in advance before you ever do your first tabletop, so that when you come out of it with your lessons learned, you just plug the information in and support it, provide it to the right groups. Some of this stuff won't necessarily roll up. If you realize that you just didn't have the right people on the call, you don't need to roll that up to a board. You just make sure that you annotate in your plan and your tables of roles and responsibilities what those additional roles are, who they are, and the contact info. But if you see a large gap, like I don't have a way of notifying anyone in the company that we had an outage, that's something that maybe needs to be rolled up. Maybe you won't own finding that solution, but you're at least the one that brings that risk to the table. My recommendation, and there's a lot of these out on the internet that you can look for of varying types, but create some way of assigning risk severity and likelihood of impact, as well as cost to remediate. So it could be something simple like, critical, high, medium, low for severity. What's my likelihood of impact or probability, percentage, maybe, or high, medium, low again, if you want to use the same terms, and then cost to remediate. I would even consider looking at the cost to remediate beforehand versus during the incident. So for example, ransomware, the cost to remediate ahead of time might be a good backup program and you spend money on it. The cost to remediate while you're in the middle of a ransomware attack, if you didn't have the good backup program, might be a ransom itself plus additional costs. Not to mention all of the costs for downtime, loss of reputation, et cetera. So make sure you think through those things, assign the risk severity, the probability, and then the cost. This gives folks, especially in the financial side of the business, a way to prioritize and make decisions. Establish a cadence for working through these open action items. The worst thing that you can do is just write them down once and then forget about them, which is really the fifth bullet here. I've seen this more times than I can count. People do a great job of holding the lessons learned. People are quick to tell you everything that went wrong in the lessons learned. And then let's say 3 months later, you're holding another scenario, you hold the second lessons learned, you compare the two, and they're virtually identical because you did nothing coming out of the first one, waited 3 months, rolled into the second one. There's nothing that gets a group of people more annoyed and upset faster during tabletops than seeing the same things happen over and over and being asked to provide the same information that's already been documented. So make sure you have a way to meet with folks, to talk about things, to escalate, to get updates. And look, at times there's going to be things that you can't afford to do or things that have to be pushed off, then annotate that. When you meet with these folks, let them know this has been raised to leadership. This is something that's maybe a next year project. That's a lot easier to accept the next time they go through this and have a failure, especially on the technology side when you're talking about how to meet, where to document, how to communicate. If the very act of meeting to try to solve a problem is impossible because you don't have a communication method that works, folks just aren't going to pay attention. And then lastly, talk about the evidence for auditors. You don't, in my opinion, you shouldn't be doing any of this simply to check a box from an auditor perspective. You should be doing this to improve your security posture. But if you're already going to do this for the security posture side of the house, why not increase the compliance side and check that box? So there's really nothing you have to do extra here. I try to put some minimum items that an auditor is going to ask for. And if you follow the steps at the beginning, you should have all of this. But just to reiterate, make sure that you have a program policy. They're going to want to read that a program exists and what your policy is, and that has executive leadership buy-in. You're going to need to establish processes and procedures for the program. So again, if my policy tells me here's what the goal for the company is, how am I actually going to do it? And that's going to be probably the largest chunk of hours and work involved, tied a little bit to the library of scenarios, because creating those can take time. But you could create 3 to 5 scenarios right at the beginning, and then every quarter add one. And over the course of a couple of years, you come up with a pretty decent, library for the organization. You need a risk register. That's where we're recording all of the risks that we find in these tabletops, what we're doing, who owns them, when we're checking back. This shows the auditors that not only did you discover problems, but that you're actively doing something. In a lot of the compliance frameworks, there's an expectation that you mature and improve over time. So if you have a risk register and every time you meet, you add items to it and you never complete any of them, you're going to show an auditor that you're not actually maturing. So yes, you're going through the motions, you get to check that box, but then you'll either be scored negatively or you may not pass if there's no maturity. Make sure that you have meeting agendas and minutes documented that you can show when you met. Calendars on in Outlook, for example, are one way, especially if you put the agenda in there. You can show when you met, who met with you, but having a Word document that has an agenda and meeting minutes in it is fantastic. That's excellent proof. And then that lessons learned documentation with open and closed action items. You can tie risk register and lessons learned together a bit, and they could be the same spreadsheet if you want, but just clearly have your risk register and your lessons learned. Again, it's a maturity thing. And on that, I will end a couple minutes early here. If there are any questions, please throw them in the chat or the Q&A section, and I will be happy to answer them. If there are no questions, I appreciate everyone's time, and thank you again for spending your lunch hour with me. All right, if there are no questions, appreciate everyone's time. Have a great rest of your day.